This is Surface Exposure, presenting the stories, insights, and efforts of those who interface with the natural world, its inhabitants, resources, and temper. This episode features a very special conversation with Dorr. For over 50 years, Jay has built and maintained trail access in the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and surrounding wilderness areas in the Salmon-Challis and Boise National Forests. To this day, Jay continues to serve on wilderness trail maintenance assignments with organizations such as the Pulaski Users Group, Idaho Trails Association, and the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Association. After a day spent clearing logs free from a trail corridor in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, Jay and I returned to our camp to sit down for some storytelling. Before our highly anticipated story time, I'd like to shout out to some folks who, in addition to supporting the development and production of this program, support and empower me in all realms of life. Marshall Dillon, Garrett Ball, Bran, Dex, and Shane Van Pelt. Thank you for everything. Y'all are awesome. I will include links to their works and projects in the show notes. There, too, you will find links to active organizations and efforts mentioned during this conversation that you may find of interest or even wish to participate in. Now, as promised, stories and tales from our Sawtooth steward, Dorr.
Correct me, it was your mother's side of the family that's been around this neck of the woods?
Yeah.
What's this neck of the woods? Where are we? We're near the geographical central center of Idaho, but what is that?
So Idaho, mostly the Wood River Valley, and then also over to the Lost River Valley, Mackey area, and Cary area in between. Surrounding areas around.
And your folks have been out here. It was your mother's grandfather?
Yeah, well, on both sides of my mother's family, her grandparents, her father's parents were early settlers in the Wood River. He was a freighter and a rancher. He started one of the early ranches, and he drove the freight wagons. George Knight drove the freight wagons between the railroad and Ketchum and the different mines around. And so he may have been into Loon Creek. Who knows? I don't know. And then my mother's mother, her grandparents were early settlers in the Cary area, and my grandmother was born in Cary, I think Cary. And her father was a farmer, and he worked in the mines in Mackey and then in the East Fork of Wood River area, and then he died from a mine accident in the East Fork of Wood River. And maybe go back even farther, his parents, let me think here. His mother, or actually his grandfather, was a scout for the Mormons coming out to Utah. And then when my great-grandfather Alden Ivy was, like 7 years old, his father decided to take on his second wife, so my great-great-grandmother said, well, okay, but you're still going to have one wife, and she took my grandfather and, ran away in the night and ended up in Cary. And then after they got settled in Cary a couple of years, my great-grandfather Alden borrowed a horse and rode all the way back down to Salt Lake and got his little brother Ray and brought him back to Idaho. Can't imagine, 7-year-old and a 10-year-old traveling that on a horse, but anyway, and then they ended up both being forest rangers in the early days of the Forest Service.
Oh, wow.
On the Sawtooth Forest.
And their names were, again?
Alden Ivy and Ray Ivy. And, Alden Ivy was my great-great-grandfather. Our great-grandfather.
Where were they posted?
I mentioned Carrie and actually Ray was the first ranger at Pole Creek over in Sawtooth Valley. And then he was mostly, I think, at they called it Flowers Mill. It was at Adams Gulch, just north of Ketchum. And he was, I still remember him. He lived into his 90s. I remember him and his wife. 2 brothers married 2 sisters. 2 Ivies married 2 Ainsworths.
Oh, wow.
So,
what do you remember of him, and which one was this?
Well, called her little grandma, but my grandmother's mother was Mary Ivy. And then her husband, Alden, was the one that died from the mine accident. But he was the one that had, went to Salt Lake to get his little brother and stuff. And Ray and Aunt Maud, they were, they lived in the 90s, so we were always meeting them on family picnics.
You remembered Ray? Tell me about Ray.
And, he's just an older fellow and really nice. And, I didn't know, as a kid, I didn't, know to ask about, what they'd done and whatever. Yeah. And so I'm not really sure what he did, after he was a forest ranger. But he was a ranger in the early days. And my great-grandmother, Mary, she lived to be 94, I think. I remember her.
Well, what year do you think they were working for the Forest Service? About what year was that then?
I don't remember when the Sawtooth Forest started. I think it's like 1906 or so, something like that. Somewhere in that area. I'd have to look it up. I don't remember the specifics, but yeah. There's a document with a archaeologist types had written that lists all the different forest rangers in the early days of the forest, where they were, and so where they were, both those brothers were rangers at different places. I don't remember the specifics other than those couple spots.
Yeah. And you mentioned the freighter.
Yeah, and that was my grandfather's father, and he'd came out on the Oregon Trail to Eastern Oregon when he was 6 after the Civil War with an older brother. So I'm assuming maybe he'd been orphaned by then. He had older brothers, and so he came out with one of them, the La Grande area where they farmed, and then at some point when he was a teenager, ran away from home from them and ended up freighting in Nevada. And then I don't remember the exact date, like Haley was started in like 1882 or something, and so he came like in 84 maybe, and a friend had rode in and decided they liked the Wood River, and they started a couple of early ranches, and then they drove freight wagons.
Man, can you imagine what a day in the life that was like?
Yeah. My grandfather talked about when he was a kid going with him, and it'd take him, like weeks to get over to, like Bay House or Seafoam or Bay Horse or wherever over. I know they said they went freighted into Atlanta, and I can't imagine going from Ketchum over Dollarhide to Rocky Bar and then over James Creek the way we came into Atlanta, and what the roads were like in those days.
Some wild country.
Yeah, and they said that the highway down the river below Stanley was built while he was still alive. And he never got over to see it, but he couldn't have believed there was a place where 2 trucks could pass anywhere. When you look at the old wagon road down the other side of the river, and they had bells and stuff on the teams. It wasn't for fancy, it was so you could hear somebody coming and somebody could get out of the way.
Yeah, how do you reverse one of those rigs?
Yeah, I don't think you can.
How many horses did they use?
Oh, I don't know. The ones they use in the Wagon Days Parade and Ketchum are 20. I think it's 20 head, isn't it? I think 20 mules.
Something like that. Yeah.
But yeah, it depends. Yeah, I don't know.
And they're carrying loads for the
mines? They'd haul supplies into the mine, then they haul the ore out to the railroad. They'd haul, whatever supplies needed into the mines, and then ore out.
And there was a spur railroad that went down the Wood River Valley to the main railroad?
Yeah, the Oregon Short Line that took off from, was somewhere down in the Rupert area, came up to Ketchum, and then another fork over to Fairfield. And then there was actually a railroad to Salmon at one time. And, I'd read that it actually surveyed this railroad all the way down the Salmon River. I can't imagine, but it never went past Salmon. And then all those have been, removed.
Oh, the times at the frontier when you were a miner or a logger or a Mormon, or I suppose there were still trappers running around home.
Yeah. My grandfather said, when he was a little kid, and they'd be camped, and the old trappers, whatever, would come out of the woods, hang around the campfire with them at night and tell them stories. And,
whoa! You're just sitting around the campfire and some trappers coming out of the woods. Yeah. That's wild. What was where'd you grow up?
Basically Haley and out East Fork of Wood River. My grandparents had sold their original ranch, but they bought this other place that they would lease the property to a neighbor for grazing cattle, but then they'd live up there in the summer and move to Haley in the winter. And so whenever I wasn't in school, I was out there running around the hills, climbing around the hills and playing around out in the swamp and whatever. I didn't play Little League or anything like that. I was too busy playing out in the mountains.
Yeah. Do you have an earliest memory for running around in nature like that? Maybe when you discovered this was something for you, or what it meant to you?
Yeah, I don't remember.
Way back when?
Yeah, I think one of my earliest memories was working on the garden or something there in Haley, and I had a little red wagon that's actually a pretty heavy steel one that had been, who knows how many generations back that had been from, but filled it full of rocks, and then I couldn't pull it. By the time I took all the rocks out so I could pull the wagon, I only had 2 or 3 rocks left in the wagon, and I was really disappointed.
Ergonomics.
Yeah.
A stonemason from a young age.
And then, I was little, my grandfather had sold his ranch and stuff, but he still had horses, and he still ended up working for other ranches and stuff, looking after cattle in the summer. So when I was little, he would work for the Grazing Association Laidlaw Park, which was out south of Cary and the Craters of the Moon. And now it's all part of the Craters of the Moon Preserve. But he would, my grandparents would live out there in a camp wagon. It looked like a sheep wagon, but cowboys lived in it. It was a camp wagon. And they had a tarp hanging on the side that those kids slept in, watching the kangaroo rats at night under the wagon. I remember that.
What did the other people in the Wood River Valley at the time do around you? What do you remember them? Some of your friends or their parents, or what was it like?
Well, the mines were still going until I think 57 when the Triumph closed down. The big one out East Fork. And
what's that? The Triumph?
Yeah, it was one of the big mines that started in the 1880s, and it pretty much ended on and off, but pretty much ran until I think 1957. So the mountain between the East Fork of Wood River and Elkhorn is pretty much honeycombed from the different mines that came in from the different directions.
So a lot of people in the valley, they worked up there?
Yeah, they worked in the mines, the different mines.
What happened when they started to close?
People either moved away to work in the mine somewhere else, or they went on to do a different other kinds of work.
Yeah. What kind of games did you and your friends play?
Oh, I mostly just played out in the woods.
Yeah. You're still doing
snow
it.
forts and stuff in the winter, and sledding and skiing and then, hiking and always following my dad around when he was hunting or fishing until I was old enough to do it myself. And family was always going out on weekend drives and picnics, and families would come from all around southern Idaho and meet somewhere like a Redfish Lake or Alturas or my grandparents' place or somewhere for big picnics. And somebody would have a boat, so people water skiing and playing on the lake. And it seemed like we did that at least a couple times a month all summer, meeting somewhere or other, somewhere between Haley and Salmon and wherever.
Has much of your family stayed in the area? Did you have did they move away? And why do people stay? Why do people move away?
My sister had moved around, but they live in Hanson, which is like 80 miles south of here, down near Twin Falls. And some of her kids are still there, and the rest of them are in Pocatello and Salt Lake area. And my brother was a soil scientist, so he moved all over eastern Idaho and eastern Montana and Oregon, and he's in Oregon now, retired. And, he was a soil scientist, so both of them found careers where we were paid to play in the dirt. I built trails, and he dug holes and filled them back in, doing soil surveys.
And you went to university for a forestry program?
Yes.
Tell me about that. Where'd you go?
I went to College of Southern Idaho, a junior college in Twin Falls the first year. Just do all the English and history and chemistry and all that general stuff. And then I went up to the University of Idaho, the forestry college up there. Pretty good program. There were people from all over the country there for the forestry program.
What's that experience like? Through a forestry program, like what are the core values? What did people kind of expect to go do with that training at the time?
Some of them probably working for, like lumber companies, like where, the big timber companies and, as foresters, and some work for the government like the Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management, those kind of agencies, and state departments, forestry departments, and some, I think what some of the others, I'm not sure what a lot of them did. Mostly, careers working with natural resources and some function or other.
Yeah, and kind of asking some of these
some of them, one good friend, had his own logging company or timber consultant company, and so they did, all different kinds of things like that. And, in the forestry classes were, I would say they weren't as intense and hard as like engineering, but they had a lot of chemistry and math and things that were. I had to work at it. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't as hard as like friends who were chemical engineers or stuff.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any fondest moments through university?
Well, between the sophomore and junior year, they had 8 weeks of field school at McCall. But the first half was more, learning forest ecology, basically, the different trees and habitat types and vegetation. And we were out, after the first day, we were out on field trips somewhere around, on day trips or, week-long camp trips somewhere. And then the second half was more, actual forest management skills like surveying and measuring trees and laying out, like a timber cell like thing or those kind of things that folks that got into actual timber management type stuff would be doing. So,
How do you determine the value of a timberland? So that's essentially what you're doing.
Yeah, well, they would set up plots, and there are different ways, but set up plots and measure like every so many trees, of merchantable size, whatever, and figure out what would be the the best type of thing, where if the selective cut of certain ones, or if it was really diseased or whatever, what was the best way to harvest it, and
and then you have to account for how hard it is to access, and the
energy
and the effort, time to get into,
whether when I was there, when we were out, it was before helicopter logging, but they were in the Grand Jean area and the big trees. They were experimenting with balloon logging.
Oh, balloon logging.
yeah, where they had these big, like Zeppelin-like things with cables and winches and stuff, and then those things would hoist up the logs, and then the winch would pull it over and they'd drop them down. And I think then they did that for a few years, and then they started with the big helicopters. It was probably better in the long run.
Probably better
but,
than balloons.
Then I remember some of the smaller loggers. They had this. It looked really scary to me. But, it looked like a crane or something. It'd have a boom out there, and then it would be a big ball like that, and then the things you hook the chokers on, and the operator would have that thing spinning. And then they would lock the spin and release the cable, and they'd go shooting out, and the choker setter was out there, with the cables wrapped around the logs, and the thing would bounce down beside him, and he'd hook it on and jump out of the way, and then the guy would winch the logs back. And I don't know how many choker setters they would have taken out before they got perfected their aim, but it's like a slingshot.
Yeah.
Where you spin it around and then send it out there, a couple hundred yards. That looked really dangerous, but there were different ways, with dozers and different things, and then they have the helicopter logging. And there are still people that horse log some places, and that's they can be more selective, and we were around.
And how do you balance the value of those productions versus the ecological value? Like, what are the checks and balances?
I had the classes and stuff, but I wasn't really into the forest management part. I worked more into the recreation part.
Let's go there then.
But
where did you go?
Well, continued working on trails in the wilderness, that kind of thing. And so.
Were you working on trails while you were in school already?
Yeah.
When did you start working trails?
My first year out of high school, I got a job on the recreation crew, which was basically cleaning the campgrounds.
Okay.
And then the next year I got on trail crew. And basically I've been doing trails, wilderness stuff ever since.
How long has that been?
My first year was in 1971 on the rec crew, and then I guess 72 the trail crew. And then retired at the end of 2018. And then I've been volunteering pretty much every summer since.
Where? Okay, I want to go. What was some of your early experiences on trail crew? What were your first impressions? At this point, you already knew you loved spending a lot of time outside, but what did it mean to go do trail?
Well, I just always knew I wanted to do something working out in the woods. So, that was... I'd always been around horses and stuff, but I didn't take advantage of learning a lot from my grandfather about them. We rode horses around, but then out doing trail stuff, then really got to learn to work with them and take care of them and manage them. And that's a skill that not a lot of folks have anymore. So it's been kind of fun, teaching other folks over the years, the ones that were interested, how to do it. But had some big learning curves at first.
Yeah, what's
you
that?
know, like in my first week on trail crew, well, actually my first day, they handed me a halter and a bucket to go bring the horses into the corral, and I'll come stampeding in, and then told me which one to catch to ride that day, and they didn't tell me they liked to rear back, and so I was tying to the corral, and somehow I had my fingers in the knot, and Little Red reared back and ripped the hide off a couple of fingers. And,
Whoa.
And then I didn't think they kept Little Red very long after that. He was pretty dangerous. He had a bad habit of doing that.
Little Red ripped the hide off your fingers.
Yeah, he was. So I learned how to tie a horse up. But
Well, welcome.
and the horse was fine out in the woods, but just tying him up, he had a bad habit. And then the first week we were working up Redfish Canyon and working up the switchbacks to Alpine Lake, and I was riding in front, and Dave was riding behind me and leading Tom Thumb Mule with our gear, and I rode by a backpacker and then stopped to talk to him, and I didn't know that Tom Thumb hated backpackers, and next thing we knew, Tom had ran all the way around Dave, had a lead rope wrapped around Dave's waist.
Whoa, that's
on his
not
horse, and he
that's a
pulled out a
suboptimal
knife and
place
cut
to
the
be.
lead rope, and Tom Thumb went bucking down the trail, throwing tools down to the next switchback, and the backpacker was plastered against a rock on the other side of the trail. Do you always do that? And I said, no, I hope not. But I learned really fast that I had to we had to maneuver around backpackers a little different.
Tom Thumb hates
Yeah.
backpackers.
There's lots of other Tom Thumb stories too. But,
Let's do Tom Thumb stories.
well, one of them, the trail crew, Phil and Keith had been using them for a while, and then we swapped animals for some reason, and I was using them out of Atlanta, and I think I'd worked up the Queens, and they came from Grand Jean around North Fork of the Boise and over to Johnson Creek, or maybe we met them in Johnson Creek and worked over to the Queens River, and then I was going to go back down the Queens River, and they were going over to Virginia Lake and out to Pettit Lake, and I was going to camp there another night. I was just working down the Queens River and came back to camp that night, and Tom Thumb had gotten loose.
Uh-oh.
He got out of his halter, I think, or got untied. I don't remember how, but anyway, I took walking off, with a halter, and followed him all the way down Benedict Creek and all the way up South Fork of the Payette, and this was like 12 miles to Virginia Lake, and he'd gotten loose, and he'd followed their pack string all the way back to the other thing, and so I got there, and they gave me a gin and tonic, and walked Tom Thumb back in the dark, and, all the way back to camp in the dark. In his older years, he got so you couldn't lead him. You just had to tie his halter up, and you just try to keep him between you, so he wouldn't, because he'd just wear the hide off his gin if you're trying to lead him. And so we were coming from Spangle Lake, and there's switchbacks going down to Ardith Lake, and I met a bunch of Boy Scouts on top, and I gave them the lecture about not cutting the switchbacks. And we started down the switchbacks. Old Tom stood up there grazing, and then he went straight down the hill. And so
Tom
much
Thumb
for the
cut
credibility of the
switchbacks.
idiot in the green uniform. Tom Thumb. Another time we got to camp, and I'd had just horse pellets on him. And I hadn't got him tied up. I was tying up the other animals, and I looked over, and he'd tried to roll with 200 pounds of pellets on him.
Nice. They
And so
love
he's
to
sitting there with all 200 pounds of pellets off on one side, just sitting there munching grass. So, okay, well, I'll finish unloading everybody else.
roll. Tom Thumb's occupied.
Yeah,
He was a mule.
yeah.
How many mules did y'all use?
Oh, it depended on what we were doing. If there were like two of us, we maybe had 3 or 4. And then later years, we had bigger crews where we were doing more construction or bigger crews, we'd take 6 pack animals and 2 riding. Well, those early years, just one of us would ride and the other would walk, and then one riding would lead the 2 or 3 pack animals.
You like working with animals like that?
Yeah. It was a big trade-off between backpacking and taking the stock, but with the stock we could go back a lot farther and stay out longer, get more done instead of spend all our time just getting there and back. So we tried to strategize which trails would be best to backpack and which ones the best to take the stock. And usually try to do day trips on the bottom and maybe short backtracks on the early part of the trail, and then take horses in for the longer parts farther back.
Which mule was your favorite?
Oh.
You can have 2 or 3.
Oh, well, there's multiple ones. When the Sawtooth National Recreation first started, took over different trails the Challis Forest had and the Boise Forest had, so we inherited some animals from them. And we got, I think, 3 animals from the Loman district. We took over the trails around Grand Jean and Graham, and there were 2 black mules. I know and you know. They were identical. They're probably sisters.
I know and you know?
Yeah. And they'd been led by a left-hander, and I like to lead with my right hand, so they were always trying to go on the other side, so the rope was always getting into the horse's tail, which they didn't like, but we managed. And I know was really touchy about her ears, that you had to be real careful not to touch her ears. And Gloria mule, a little red mule, and she was one that the first day out she'd like to turn upside down somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going up Alturas the first day, and she'd turn it upside down, and we'd have the crosscut saw kind of bowed around a pack on the side, and instead of taking it off and laying it down, I gave it a toss and ended up with 2 short saws that broke when it lit. Oops, that was my fault. But we don't carry saws like that anymore because they're too brittle. And then another time at the Queens River, the old miners' bridge was been removed because it was too dangerous, and they hadn't built a new bridge yet, so we had to ford the river. So she'd rolled upside down in the middle of the river,
with gear,
right by the trailhead. Yeah, with the sleeping bags. Of course.
Sleeping bags right in the river.
Of course, yeah.
Nice.
But it was a good hot day, so
there you go.
we were dried out. And then when she got older, we were out grazing. We'd have them hobbled and the bell on the horse, and when it got time to bring them in, if we hadn't got them before dark, she'd hide under a tree, and you could hear her clanking until you walked toward her, and she'd stop, and then you'd hear clanking behind her. And one time we didn't get her in time, and up in the top of the casino, and she went all the way out to Boundary Creek. Somebody had to hike out the next day and find her next to a horse pasture down there.
Oh, it's fun working with those animals. Yeah, those mules like to roll. Do horses do that, or is it a mule thing?
Oh, they all
do, yeah.
They're all different. You know, we had I guess maybe a favorite mule. We had a Nelly mule, and the withers, the shape of her back, you couldn't keep a pack on her going downhill.
Huh.
So we swapped, and I rode her, and then I just get off and lead them down the hills, which was the best thing to do anyway. Going down hills, steep hills, and so it worked. So we used her for a long time that way. We had a big mule, lady mule, that her shoulders were my head height, and her ears were really that big. But big mule, and she was a real teddy bear, but she'd hurt her foot and rammed a stick up inside her foot or something, and so we had to keep her on the lawn at the work center most of the summer, and there was a telephone in the office and a telephone on the outside of the barn, so she knew if the phone rang there'd be somebody there answering the phone, so she'd be to the barn first, and you almost had to shut yourself inside the barn to talk on the phone because she'd be rubbing against you like that. Yeah.
What are some of the lessons that working with those animals?
Like I worked first 2 summers on the trail crew with people who were more experienced than me, and then the third summer, they sent me over to Atlanta with somebody new that hadn't been around horses at all, and I think we had a horse and a couple mules, and any old packers that saw us that week, they'd still be rolling laughing. I thought I knew what I was doing, but
Yeah.
I was completely clueless. I hadn't been paying that much attention to somebody else taking the lead. And it was pretty much a disaster. But that weekend, looked up an old friend of the old outfitter, whatever, and got some good packing lessons. Things went better after that.
What other projects did you do? So where did you go with these pack mules and without? And what kind of projects did you do?
Well,
what's it look like to build trail? And where?
Yeah,
you could start with where, like where you've worked in a kind of you traveled much for work doing this sort of stuff?
No, not really. Off to other parts of the forest to help them with special projects. Mostly like with blasting or rock work, that type of thing.
So where have you worked then? Where primarily have you worked? Describe
Well, mostly, I've worked
your neck of the woods.
Mostly in the Sawtooth Wilderness and what's the White Clouds Wilderness now. And done a lot of major reconstruction projects for the old trails where, going really steep up the hill or going through a bunch of creeks and swamps and bogs and really bad places, and relocating the trails to, better sustainable grades and sustainable locations, and bypassing as many, bad creek crossings, and, trying to mitigate the damage, erosion and resource impacts and the hazards to the trail users. And so built a lot, like the Livingston Mill Cats Divide Trail between Germania Creek and Frog Lake. That part of it we worked on for a big chunk of 6 summers over a 12-year period, doing different sections of it. And big casino, little casino, major reconstruction, big chunks of those. That's in the north of the White Clouds. Where else? Elk Meadows, top of Smiley Creek, headwaters of Salmon River. Those are some of the bigger projects, and then a lot of short reroutes and building log puncheons, which is basically like a boardwalk, or building turnpikes and culverts and stuff, turnpikes where we'd have to pack gravel, usually on a pack animal.
You would pack gravel in?
No, we'd quarry it somewhere.
Okay, yeah.
In the first, and kind of backtracking, in the 1960s, after the Wilderness Act, 64, the Wilderness Act, the Sawtooth was a primitive area from the 1930s. And then with the Wilderness Act, they put a lot of money into constructing and reconstructing trails in the Sawtooth, to get people into that. And so through a lot of the boggy areas, they packed in pressure-treated lumber, basically 2x4s mostly. And some of them had packed in horses, some of them they helicoptered in, some of them they parachuted in, some they pulled in on sleds behind snow machines. The primitive area, so they did use chainsaws and motorized equipment then. And so did a lot of those out here. And then in the late 70s and early 80s, we tried building puncheons out of native logs so that it looked more appropriate in the wilderness. But we built quite a few of those, but the kind of trees we have here, they don't last very long. So we basically, every time you do that a couple times, you kind of clear cut everything in a reasonable distance. So we went back to using treated lumber where we had to. And then we tried to, some engineers come up from the regional office in Ogden that showing us how to build turnpikes, where we could find quarry gravel and build the trail up with gravel. So basically we'd line the sides of the trail with rock, and then put down a geotextile, was basically like a pile jacket, like material.
Yeah.
And then cover it with gravel.
Yeah.
That we'd, the first ones we did, we quarried out of, gravel bars, late in the summer after the water was low.
Yeah.
And then after bull trout were listed as a threatened species, that was taboo, messing around in the creek bed, so we had to figure out other things, and so improvised quite a few other different ways we could build material to build it up. And then, the first choice would be to relocate the trail if we could find some place to move the trail to drier ground to avoid the swamp. That was the best. And if we could find some place to build a turnpike, material to build a turnpike, then we did that. And to build the turnpikes, we'd have somebody shoveling in the buckets. And then the first ones we had were plywood boxes with a little hasp on it and a hinge. And you dump the buckets into that, and then we got to where you were building the gravel, take a hammer and knock the hasp off and dump the gravel. And then I got somebody to build them out of this heavy fabric like they use on construction projects and stuff for demolition.
Yeah.
And with a metal hoop and hooks on the decker ring, and then it was kind of a funnel shape with a rope that I just tie after the pack rings, and then the buckets into that, and then when you got to where you're emptying, you just untie one knot and funnel it in, so that worked a lot better. And then the company that built that went on to building them for a lot of other folks.
Huh.
But that was a good design.
That's pretty cool.
So we did a lot of that. And then if there are places where we couldn't relocate the trail or find a gravel source, then we went back to packing in pressure treated lumber 2x4s. So we packed a lot on horses, and places that weren't in the wilderness we helicoptered in, and some of them they're close enough we just packed in by hand. And we did, for one project, like on Johnson Creek in Norfolk to Boise after the big fire, we went to the minimum tool thing and got permission to helicopter them in. We've had everything helicoptered in 2 days instead of up and down the trails with pack stock for 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
The wear and tear justified it, the minimum, get them in there and done with, and then we go in and build them.
Helicopter is the minimum tool concept in that case.
For certain situations, yeah. And we've one big project up Barron Creek out of Grand Jean. We were building bridges, and they were in lengths of lumber. I think they were 16 foot, 2x10s, and the old-time packers, how they built a lot of the early bridges and fire lookouts and stuff. We had this basically a fifth wheel thing on top of, bolted on top of the deckers of the pack saddles.
Yeah.
Decker is a pack saddle with an iron ring, 2 iron rings that you tie things to. So they'd bolt on top of that, and then they'd pivot. And the one in front would look kind of like the front rack on a logging truck. It would pivot, and then the back one would look like that, but it had Teflon rollers, so when you clamp it down on the front one and the back one, it'd just sit there. So when the pack animals went through dips or around corners or around things, it wouldn't pull. If they were fastened together, they'd be pulling each other over.
Yeah.
With the Teflon roller, it could go.
Huh. Yeah.
So they got a company in Missoula to build. They were other places were doing it too, building new ones out of aluminum, a lot lighter and whatever. And then we have an old packer from 9 Mile in Montana come down and help us, for a few days on how to get started, and then practicing the corral and stuff. And then it, you didn't do that with every animal, but we kind of figured out who, and it took a bit for them to figure out they had to go down the trail, nose to tail, and not sideways.
Yeah.
Side by side around big ponderosas and stuff. We had a few adventures. I remember one of them, Moses was my supervisor, old packer, helping us, and he got off the adjust the load and knock these glasses off. And he was crawling around in the bushes on his hands and knees, and the mules milling around. And one of those things you wish somebody had a video camera for. But there was a one place on the trail where it was switch backing up a really steep, and you held your breath every time you went by, hoping nobody did something silly, fall off the mountain. But that ended up, and I had crews going in ahead before we started hauling, really clearing the trail out good and wide. And I remember one place, one switchback corner, there was a big Doug fir, and the front board would clear about that much as you go around the corner.
Just inches.
Yeah. But
like an 18
two of us, Deborah Peters and I, pretty much spent most of 2 summers packing lumber in.
For a project.
Yeah, for these bridges. Yeah. And one year on Labor Day, there were hikers and bears and dogs and things everywhere, and we were packing up Barren Creek, and came to this little creek, and a backpacker had stopped, had his pack off, and he had his dog on a leash. And we rode by, and thanking him for holding his dog, and then he went to put his pack back on. The dog, he dropped the leash accidentally. And the dog took off to chase the mules, and oh boy, it was more than I'd ever imagined. We had a new mule. It was like the second time we'd used her, and she was a little spooky, Gertie, and she panicked, and I was leading a couple mules in front, and Deborah was leading a couple animals behind, and I looked back, and the mules were on each side of Deborah, the one she was leading, and they clotheslined her, the lead rope between them, and knocked her off over the front of her horse, and the 3 animals jumped over top of her, great circus act. And I was trying to get John Mule tied up and stopped, and he got away from me. I went back to see if Deborah was dead or not, and she was okay. And John Mule ran 3 miles back to the barn at Grand Jean, and we weren't hauling the overhead. We were just hauling. I knew there was a busy weekend, so we were just hauling the little curbs, the logs we stacked up underneath the bridge, the little 4-foot or 5-foot pieces on the sides.
Yeah.
And he ran all the way back. When I finally caught up with him, he was back in the corral eating hay with these bundles of lumber on his side. and as the dog ran by, I threw a rock at him, and I was never good at rocks. If Deborah could have thrown a rock, she probably would have got him. But we called it the white dog stew. What do we want for dinner? We'll have white dog stew.
The special.
And then the worst thing was I had Deborah stay and help the guy with these blisters while I went back to find John Mule. But the next year at Labor Day, we took everybody back to the pasture and went down to Prairie Creek and worked over the weekend.
Can you share any strange or fun or memorable user encounters? Public encounters?
One of them, my first summer over in Atlanta, we were working up the Middle Fork in there above the Leggett Junction between that and Mattingly. And this family come down the trail with a man and woman and 3 kids and I think 3 dogs and 2 goats and a cat. And one of them was carrying a milk bucket with wax paper over top with stew left over from the night before. And the guy was a logger in Garden Valley, and he and the goats had just came in the night before to meet him, but everybody but the littlest kid and the littlest dog had packs on. And the woman and the 3 kids and the dogs and the cat, they came in from Grand Jean and went up Barren by Kramer and Ardeth and all the way down to Atlanta, and then he just got off work the day before and had hiked in and met him up above Mattingly somewhere. He said the only trouble they had was going over Kramer Pass in the thunderstorm, and they kept losing the cat down underneath the big rocks.
Wow.
And then all the animals were named after characters from the Lord of the Rings, Frodo and Bilbo and whatever. That was
Touché.
not long after that book was out. It was real
Touche.
popular. Yeah.
What a cast.
To look like, a family on the way to Oregon. The Indians had burned their wagon and killed their oxen, and they were on foot now.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, the funnest folks I remember seeing those folks.
They just need costumes.
Remember a few bad encounters, but not very many. Like when we were hauling those bridges in, we met a couple backpackers, and they hated horses, and they weren't going to step off the trail. And, these guys panic, you're dead, but they weren't, they wouldn't get that far off the trail.
Sure.
But we got by them. But another one when we were working up Yellow Belly, and these little switchbacks, and we bought a couple horses that ended up being, like a used car. It was not a good deal. One of them was a windsucker who would get the krail, and and it's a bad nervous habit. And the other had some kind of epilepsy. Just out of the blue, he'd turn backflips.
Like these horses,
and so we got rid of them the end of that summer, and we never bought any more horses from that rancher. But
a windsucker.
Yeah, but we're packing in, and there was a guy hiker carrying a little kid on his shoulder, and he didn't want to get out of the way, and whatever this horse freaks out, he'll take you both out. But most encounters were good.
You said you were doing blasting stuff?
Yeah.
What kind of blasting stuff?
Mostly blasting rocks and stumps, building trail and trail relocations and trail repairs.
Yeah, that's a minimum tool concept.
Well, got a granite wall like that. How are you going to get the trail through it?
Yeah.
You can do so much with hammers and picks and bars, and then you have to have something a little stouter.
Yeah, it's got to blow it up.
So we did a lot of when they built a lot of the trails in the Sawtooth, it was pretty various. They used power drills, and then I mostly used them in the like over in the White Clouds and the boulders, the non-wilderness trails. We're relocating a trail and had to go through rock where we couldn't move it with the hand tools. We'd drill holes and then use explosives to break the rock. Sometimes, if the rock was soft enough, you could put a chisel on the rock drill and break the rock up that way. But most of the time, you had to drill holes to blast them. Then we had one project in the Sawtooth where the trail over the pass between Pettit and Yellow Belly had fallen off the hill, and so it was just a granite wall. And so we moved everything we could with hand tools, and then we just had to use the old hand drill, a little star bit, and hammer, and whack, whack, quarter turn, whack, whack, quarter turn, and I think we had to make about 40 holes down at ground level, waist high, head high, and then I even had some packed in a ladder to get up higher. And, a lot of respect for all the old-time miners. There's thousands of miles of tunnels around here that were built that way. So,
whack, whack, quarter turn.
Yeah.
Whack, whack, quarter turn.
And we tried to, get the hikers going through to go by. You got to pound 20 times, whatever. But everybody would just laugh at us. But one Boy Scout did stop and hammer a while.
Oh, nice. Good old volunteer work.
And we had some backcountry horsemen that were up there helping us for a while. And we had used to get American Hiking Society people crews out for like a 10-day hitch helping those projects. So we had some of those up there on the project one day, and we're sitting around at lunchtime, and all the American Hiking Society folks were men, and we said, how come no many women came? And somebody said, well, the men opened the catalog, said Sawtooth Mountains, Idaho, Sawtooth Wilderness, Idaho, and signed up. And the women opened the catalog and read down the rest of the description, hand drilling, and they went to the Tetons.
Did you have fun blasting?
Yeah, it was a blast. yeah, it was really fun. Yeah.
But you have some explosive stories.
Yeah. It was a really useful tool.
How many shots have you done?
Oh,
Aren't you supposed to count?
I've got the logbook somewhere. I don't know. We did shots with the 4-day drill holes in them. It was pretty fun. And on that one up on the Snowy Side Pass, we were doing all that. We were up there for I don't know how long, drilling those holes, and there were people climbing Snowy Side Peak every day. And then I think it was October by the time we got it ready to blast, and there weren't many hikers, and so we had it all set up, everything, all the holes loaded, just ready to go. And Nanny and Kid Goat come walking by. So wait, Mose. So they're out of the way. And then I found couple old photos in the warehouse at Sawtooth Valley back in the cupboard in the box, and one of them had this granite slab and the mountain goat in the middle of it and a bunch of rope. And then later, after I was the blaster, we were looking at it, and they were blast holes where somebody had drilled to build trail, and with the deck cord coming out of the holes all connected together, and somebody had it all set up, and the goat would walk in the middle of it before they set it off, and somebody had a camera, got a picture of it. And I'm thinking it must be up on the trail to Alpine Lake at Redfish, but it could be anywhere.
What was your first day like? Like, how'd that feel?
First day?
Yeah, blasting.
Oh, well, my supervisor was a blaster, so a couple of us worked with him for a lot of years, helping set up and everything. And then we finally got to go to a blasting class where they have to be a blaster on your own. The blasters had to recert every 3 years as a week-long training, where you do all the safety, all the protocol stuff, and learn the rules and stuff, and then out in the field for a couple days, actually setting off charges and stuff, and with the other blasters helping teach. And then you work as an apprentice for several years until your supervisor feels comfortable that you can do it by yourself. Like the ABC Sawyer type thing, basically. You work under somebody else for a while until you're comfortable, and then you go back to the blasting class, and if the other blasters from the region think you're comfortable, then they can sign you off, and then you have to go back every 3 years to keep up with making sure you're not getting bad habits and missing something, and keeping up with the new rules and protocols, and learning new techniques and new materials and techniques, and but first working with it, it is kind of nervous, but the stuff we work with is actually pretty safe until you get to put the detonators in there.
What were you using?
Mostly they called it an emulsion, and the chemistry of it, all of it is basically some kind of a nitrogen compound, and then with other things in it. And this stuff was what we used the most was most of what we used, especially for drill holes and stuff, came in sticks. It looked like dynamite. It had a paper or a plastic cover. Most of what we had plastic covers now. I think maybe at first they had paper covers, but whatever. Look like sticks of dynamite, and you could stick down drill holes, or you could bundle a bunch of them together and fasten together for a bigger thing. And then it came in, you get it in pouches and one time up redfish, or like a house-sized boulder rolled off the mountain sitting in the trail, and when they go around it, so Mosa came up with these big sausages of the same stuff you'd stick on there. And then sometimes we use, they call it ANFO, ammonium nitrate, but basically it's fertilizer.
Yeah.
And in the early days, they'd mix, like a 50-pound bag of ANFO and a gallon can of diesel mixed in it. But now it came with the all mixed already. And then it took like a equivalent of half a stick of dynamite or something else to set that off. And that, I'm sure that's probably what they're using on in the mines and stuff. Except they back up with a big truck and pour it into the boreholes out of a big truck, and they have some kind of a charge probably in the bottom that sets them off. That's mostly what we used. And then we used some fireline explosive designed for laying through real thick brush, heavy sod, thick brush, blow the vegetation away, and then cover everything with dirt, a way to building fire lines.
Okay.
And I never used them on, I guess I used them on fire a couple times, and that's something you could like wrap around a tree or something if you're trying to take down a tree. There's one way to do that.
Tree that's like too dangerous to cut.
Yeah. So we've used explosives to take down hazard trees that are too dangerous to saw. But you can put the explosives on it and be several hundred feet away when the tree comes down. So that was they even had teams for a while that were set up that you could go to fires and stuff to take down the hazard trees. I mostly did it along roads and campgrounds and some on the trails.
Have you had or seen any close calls? Misses with that kind of stuff? Or in general, doing trail work?
Well, lots of close calls with the logs over the years, just because of the multitude of them. With the blasting, no. But you really, like flying an airplane, everything, you make sure you're doing every little thing right. And, a lot of backup checks. And
what about Sawyer's stories? You said you had some close calls with logs.
Yeah, logs, yeah.
Teach us young Sawyers. Share your experience with us.
Yeah.
What don't you do?
Yeah, I remember one up around redfish where it was outside the wilderness using chainsaws. And I was cutting those stuff that looked more hazardous, and then we got the one that looked pretty. One of the newer sawyers saw it, and we hadn't walked out the whole log, and the thing pivoted and knocked him over after, when he made the release cut, dropped the weight off the log, and it swung around. It was a log about that big, and as it was, it didn't hurt him. It bruised him, but it could have broke both legs. It was one of those that we didn't check the whole length of the log. And another one was cutting a log, that was down almost on the ground on a really shallow slope, and I was on a downhill side, and I didn't take the handle off to get out of the way, and I was standing on the side of the log, and maybe it was the end of a log, or we'd made a first cut maybe, but anyway, and then there was a log that wasn't going to move, but I was on the wrong side and I hadn't taken the handle off, and when they made the release cut, the log rolled, and I was able to jump up in the air as the log rolled under me. But I was 30 years younger then. I don't think I could have jumped that high now or that fast.
Nice trick.
But I should have had the handle off, and then as I was getting down, I should have been on the other side of the saw. And another time, the Middle Fork of the Boise, there was a big spruce tree had fallen lengthwise, or fir tree had fallen lengthwise of the trail. And first thing, I was, it was a big long tree, so I was working on some limbs and somebody else was working on them way down toward the stump end, and a new sawyer and this axe came flying by, a Pulaski came flying by, front
How
of my
close?
face, and it got out of his hand. It glanced off and went flying by, and so that's where I
Foot?
anal about only one person chopping at a time, and make sure everybody's out of the way. And then even worse, I think maybe we made one cut, and then we had this big chunk, this log that was still about that big, and I was sawing and still had quite a bit of wood left, and so I was trying to get down as close as we could, and it broke. And luckily I was standing on the one side, and I had room to, like I was cutting here, and I had room to step back against a tree where this log went rolling by. A big log like that.
Like 3 feet
I
wide.
shouldn't have been there at all, but luckily, at least on this side, if I'd been on this side, I would have been done for.
You've gone like 3 feet wide.
Yeah,
It would have steamrolled.
but
you.
that's where I really anal about. Take the handle off, finish it.
Yeah, from the uphill side.
Yeah, from the uphill side.
right?
No matter how benign it looks, just do it. Get in the habit of doing that, so when something happens, you're not going to get stuck.
Yeah, put yourself in a position
Yeah,
of most advantage.
Yeah, and then
Right.
I've seen saws really get manged up too. That we had one that Dave sharpens really good saws, but in the earlier days, the best saw I found was stuck in a corner behind a cabinet in the warehouse in Atlanta.
Ooh,
And
stash.
some old-time filer had really known what he was doing. This thing pulled out. It was an Atkins, and so I called it was Elsie. We had an older lady that worked in the office at the headquarters. It was Elsie Adkins, and so this was an Atkins, and so the saw's name was Elsie. And I hoarded that saw for years, but we were cutting some, I think it was a hang-up tree maybe, and it pivoted or did something, and it made a big kink in the end of the saw.
Shucks.
And I was able to get it hammered out, but that's where and I've had a few other times, where the log will drop and then it'll jam the saw in the ground and, really mess up the teeth and can kink the saw. So that's another reason to always finish the cut with just the tip of the saw.
Yeah.
So if you mess it up, if you get a big kink in the middle of the saw, you basically got 2 3-foot saws.
Yeah, for sure.
So
these saws are pretty special.
Yeah.
A lot of folks listening may not know too much about these old crosscut saws.
yeah, these crosscut saws we're using, they're all, they were made in the 20s, 30s, 40s, maybe into the 50s. People and chainsaws took over, and they were made out of, the steel they had then, and a lot of them were ground. They call them taper ground or crescent ground. So the back of the saw, away from the teeth, is narrower than the teeth, so it doesn't pinch in the curve and the notch you're making as you're sawing the log. And nobody's figured out a mechanical way to make those tapered saws nowadays. And I guess all the old equipment has been destroyed, and then I think saws would explode once in a while where they were grinding them down, whatever technique they were using. It was kind of hard on the people working in this mill.
Yeah, it was
making them.
rather dangerous.
Yeah, but they were really good, and so there's, to find a good saw, it's there's only so many of them out there anymore. And the saws they make now, the modern made saws, they just don't cut as well. They aren't as good as and a lot of the modern saws are just plain garbage. They're made out of really cheap metal, and they aren't filed right, and you can almost bend the teeth with your thumb, and so they aren't cut very well. So the old saws are real treasures to really take care of, and if they're sharpened right and you have good technique, they're a pleasure to use. Otherwise, they're a misery whip. If you dull them up, get them in the rocks, bend them, it is miserable.
Why are they so valuable? I mean, like, they're a relic of the past.
Yeah.
Or are they?
Yeah, they are. Yeah. Well, they don't make them. I mean, there's only a limited number of them out there.
Who uses them? Who likes them?
Well, everybody working in a wilderness, you're not allowed to use motorized equipment, as in chainsaws. mechanized equipment in the wilderness. And then I've used them on a lot of non-wilderness trails. It's easier to pack around a crosscut and a couple wedges than it is a chainsaw and the gas and the oil and extra chain and the tools to keep the chainsaw running. You know, there's a big trade-off. The crosscut's a lot easier to carry around if you're not expecting lots and lots of sawing.
What's your favorite model of crosscut?
Oh, I don't know. That old Atkins. I really like that one. It's still in Sawtooth Valley somewhere. It's been sharpened a couple times by other folks. But I don't know. I've accumulated a few saws of my own. Got some pretty nice ones.
Yeah, it's quite a collection. Thanks for sharing that.
Sharpened up some, and then when I was first working, this was a primitive area, so we used chainsaws, and then it was designated wilderness, so we were looking around and pulling out the crosscuts, and they didn't cut very well, and we tried using bow saws, which is great if you're hanging in the apple tree, hanging on with 3 paws and trying to saw with the other limb, but out in the woods, it's amazing you can get a triple bends in the log with a bow saw if you aren't careful. If you go down the trail and you see someone that's been cut by the bow saw, you can tell. So a couple of us started looking around and kind of we found some old saw manuals and started finding tools, and this funny thing hanging on the wall, it's a jointer. I always wondered what it was. and we kind of taught ourselves how to sharpen saws, and then eventually got to a saw sharpening class, and then we were sending saws to some smoke different crews were sharpening saws, and then we found other folks eventually, I had all the tools and stuff, but it's something you want to do a lot to be proficient at it, so found other filers that are really good at it. You can really mess it up really fast with just one little wrong whack. It looks like a simple tool, but it's really pretty complicated. And every tooth has to be the exact same length. And the cutter teeth are actually bent out, and so they all have to be exact same bend. And the rakers, the ones that drag the chips out, all have to be just the perfect, all exact same height and a certain depth, shorter than the cutters, and shaped just right. And if any of them, even just like 1 or 2 teeth, are out of whack, it'll either won't cut anything or it'll really drag and make your day really miserable. Oh, it's a real art. You have to have a lot of patience and skill, repetitive, but keeping everything to exact specs to make it work.
They are really precise instruments.
I guess extrapolate to a rocket or a satellite, whatever, everything's to the specs, but
yeah.
But those two.
Let's hear some rainy day stories. What did you and the trail crew do when it started raining real heavy?
I went backpack trip up to Mattingly, and just started pouring for a couple days. Everything was soaked. We just packed up and backpacked out to Atlanta. Got down to Leggett Creek. It was in June when the creek was high, but it didn't matter. You just waded on through the creek. And one time we were camped up in the top of Johnson Creek. We'd come in from the Little Queens, and it started raining, and just kept it up, and we finally just packed up and went back to Atlanta to dry out the house and then the sun came out and came back in, and other crew came in from Grand Jean, and they were down in Johnson Creek, and that might have been the time they were camped on a nice gravel bar by the creek. Well, they found out how the gravel bar got there, but pretty soon they had to move their tents and stuff somewhere else. And they'd flooded out, but they weren't where they could retreat, and I was. There one time we were working up by Spangle Lake in the head of the Middle Fork of the Boise, and it'd been bluebird sky days like the last couple days here. Not a cloud in the sky, and I think Rich had maybe spilled some coffee on his sleeping bag or something, so we had it left out on a big rock to dry in the sun. Well, we'd worked down and up Fly Trap 5 miles away over in this other lake basin in the afternoon, and a big thunderstorm rolled in, and it rained all the way back to camp. Well, that sleeping bag I had to be pretty miserable for a few nights. But I always leave camp with everything tucked away with the assumption it's going to rain while I'm gone.
Any flash floods?
Yeah.
Sort of deal?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been back there, when going up the trail and coming back down. One was a Tom Thumb story. He was out in front of me. We came in and they're going down at the end of the 10-day hitch above Grand Jean, and he came up, there's a little pile of dirt like a foot high in the trail, and he was looking up and down. And, come on, Tom, get going. And he went straight up the hill through this big, thick, willow jungle. What's wrong with you, Tom? And I got up, and there was a 10-foot gully in the trail that wasn't there 8 days earlier. Where a storm had hit. And so up the trail behind Tom, through the willows so we could get across the gully, and we came back in next week. We know we're going to build trail for a while. And another one, we just got to the Queens River trailhead, and I hadn't even unloaded the horse, and this thunderstorm came in and just pounded, really pounded for quite a while, and then it cleared off, and the river turned brown and looked like looking down the road. And a road crew was working on the road between the Queens River and Atlanta, and it had washed out the road, and they had to use a dozer to be able to get back down to their camp that night. And then it had washed big gullies across the trail, so we had to build trail in multiple places up the canyons that day, or when we got up the canyons.
You were telling us earlier today about when you got rescued on the airplane, where the airplane had to come in to rescue you.
Oh, that was where we did the minimum tool thing to get permission to helicopter in lumber, and so it was like in June, before the road into Graham was open, and they helicoptered lumber. They flew me and I think probably 2 Helitack. I don't know, there were 3 or 4 of us, 3 maybe, into Johnson Creek, and then they long lines slung in, on cables and nets with the lumber from over in Sawtooth Valley over top into Johnson Creek, and we unbundled them. And before they could come back to get us, somebody looked, and the helicopter and the pilot had expired their certification for flying for the forest, and they shut them down. So we were back in Johnson Creek, so we had to hike out 9 miles, carry in. They hadn't packed out, so we had these big bundles of nets, and then the big heavy swivels that they're attached to. And, they let them down in a line, and then they have a way to release them. And so I think we had 4 of those and 3 people. Yeah. I think we had 4 nets and 3 people, so somebody had to carry 2 of them, and so we had to hike the 9 miles down and out to the road, climbing over logs all the way down, and then we had to hike 4 miles down the road to the airstrip where they were going to pick us up, and the airplane took off just so we got inside of the airstrip because he had to be back in Stanley on the ground before dark. So, we got to spend the night in Graham. They came back in the morning and got us. But another, I always really think about where I set up my camps and where storms and stuff. Looking, at the gullies across the rear here, and the gullies we came across on the way in, and the gullies when we tried to get into Graham. That when they were building trail up Barron Creek in the 60s, I think there was a crew in there all summer building trail, and the story was the foreman's wife had died, so the assistant ranger rode in and got him out of bed in the middle of the night to go out for the funeral. And they rode out. And when they came back in, there'd been a big storm, and it had totally wiped out their camp, their wall tent, the chainsaws, everything. They couldn't. It was all
Gone.
Totally. This big storm to come off the hill, and if they hadn't been gone out of bed, and I guess the storm came in while they were riding out, and so if they'd been in bed, it would have wiped out the whole crew, or potentially could have. So.
Wow.
The fun one in Johnson Creek, there were some partway up the canyon, there were 2 cabins, I think were trappers' cabins in the 1940s. And one of them was pretty ratty, just a log shell, and I think it still had a roof, but it was, pretty well gone. But the other one, it was above the trail. You could have fixed up and moved in if you wanted to. It was a cabin, but driving down the trail one day, and dang, I thought the cabins were here. I looped around and came back, and there'd been a little storm out of the little side drainage. At times of year I was in there wasn't even water in the creek crossing the trail, and the upper cabin was completely gone, and you can see where the bottom cabin was, and there was a rock about the size of a Subaru sitting where that cabin had been. And then the amazing thing was, above the trail, next to the upper cabin, was the outhouse, and the water had went around it, a teardrop around it, and still all the pine needles that hadn't touched it.
Wow.
And it totally wiped out the other 2 cabins. And the outhouse, it had kids in there because it had a regular size hole and a kid size hole. It had this family in there the trapper had. Had to rebuild trail a lot, where big gullies that come down, and you build over them, or you figure out somehow to get around the giant gully, or build a trail through it.
What are some lessons you've taken or draw from doing this kind of work? Lessons that follow you into the rest of your life? Lessons that you can share with others?
I don't know, I guess it's I think it's a kind of a satisfying work. At the end of the day, you can look back and you've accomplished something concrete, versus working in the office. It seems like some days you're kind of spinning in circles and you're deeper in the hole than when you started. And out here, we cut 41 logs a day, and we did a bunch of other good things.
Yeah, you're maintaining access into nature, into public lands, into wilderness.
Thinking back some of the big projects we worked on, and things that were, really some really nasty, bad pieces of trail that were really impacting the resource and dangerous for the users, and really made a lot of improvements over the years and restored, rehabbed. The fun part, building a trail is when you get to obliterate the old trail when you're done.
Yeah.
And redo it, and get it so the gullies and stuff will fill in, and any trail I've rehabbed, nobody else is going to walk over it more than once.
Yeah.
Make sure it's looked over. I'm thinking of different projects, with the forest hydrologists and the road crew and stuff, burying old mining roads and building a new trail up in a more sustainable place. And they were, with their equipment, they were totally, you walk back now and, other than a trails person or engineer, you wouldn't know there was no road there. And they did actually things, restored channels and stuff where roads of the creek, the road has captured the creek and turned into a giant gully, and they filled them back in and put the meanders back in the river, and doing that on a lesser scale with the trails, with the hand tools. And then thinking about all the different people I worked with over the years, and the fellow was, I guess, maybe you could call wilderness manager or whatever. When I first heard Dave Lee, he said his greatest joy was taking bucket-ass kids and making men of them. So, thinking back all the different people I've worked with over the years, they've gone on to be, professional foresters and doctors and attorneys and nurses and professors and writers and farmers and engineers and whatever they've gone on to do with sexual careers in life. And folks that come in and, not a clue what they want to do with their life and finally figure it out, and now they're emergency room doctors or engineers or something. Folks that are...
For those that don't got a clue what they want to do with their life, trail's not so bad, huh?
Yeah. And then we've had, folks that are like ski patrolmen or whatever, that they, for years, they work on the trails in the summer and, ski hill in the winter as patrolmen or instructors or whatever. And a little break in between, kind of a lifestyle. And a lot of fire crews and stuff that do the same kind of thing. So kind of like a winter ski job and a summer fire or trail job.
Are there any personalities that you've worked with that stick out?
A lot of good folks.
Yeah.
One, Tom Elder, he'd met some folks that worked on the crew at Sawtooth Valley up at college at the University of Idaho. So he just showed up with his backpack and guitar case and duffel bag and hung around till they hired him. And then we were working around, and it'd been his first trip to actually go out of the Wilderness Ranger to backpack in the White Clouds and same with the Washington Basin, but he was hadn't stormed since he'd been there. Blue sky, and he's looking at this tent. Boy, this thing's awful heavy, and I think I really need it. And somebody said, "Nah, great." And other thing, he was a sleepwalker. So in the bunkhouse, he'd leave the light on. And he'd just sleep in the living room on the couch. The light on, he didn't wake up. And out in the woods, he'd tie a rope around his ankle and tie it to a little tree or a rock or something to wake him up if he got up to sleepwalk. And so his first night, he was up in the Washington Basin without a tent, and it started raining during the night. And he hadn't taken a flashlight either. In those days, a lot of us were mountain men. Flashlights are for sissies. And, other stories about that. But anyway, he got up trying to find some tree to get under, and he fell in a mine shaft. And, like 10 feet down or something. And then he didn't know if he was on the bottom or just on the ledge. So he was sitting in there on this ledge trying to stay awake all night, the rain beating in on him. He didn't want to fall asleep and sleepwalk off into a deeper hole. And when it got daylight, he had to be on the bottom and he could climb out. But he didn't tell anybody for about 3 or 4 years. His first night out in the woods, he fell in the mine shaft. Then he became a science teacher eventually. But he was a chimney sweep in the winter, and when he was at school, and that fit his personality. He was one of those folks that I'll work for 5 days in the wilderness, come home, do whatever for the weekend, and then like on the night or maybe the morning, you're supposed to go, oh, I hadn't taken a shower and changed clothes yet. And we didn't have laundry facilities at the work center, so a couple times this summer, one summer he brought a rubber raft and a little one-man raft, so he'd put it in, hike down to the river, float down to Stanley in the raft, do his laundry, and then hitchhike, fold up his raft and hitchhike back. And when he'd leave to go back to school in the fall, he'd give away whatever wouldn't fit in his backpack and duffel bag. Worked out.
Where did he travel from?
I think he grew up in Kansas. And then he moved to Idaho, and then eventually ended up in Vernal, Utah as a science teacher.
So you spent all your years working for Forest Service.
Yeah.
But there's a number of other kinds of groups and organizations that do this trail work. Would you be too kind to recite some of the organizations in Idaho that do this sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, maybe not in Idaho, but there's National Park Service.
Yeah.
Crews, work with a lot of folks that have been, on different Park Service crews around the country. And then in Idaho, there's as far as other agencies, there's the Idaho Department of Parks and Recreation, and they have crews, and they're funded, a lot of it is funded from the ORV, off-road vehicle part of the gas taxes, and then the ORV stickers, licenses. And so they have crews that go around the state on any motorized trail they'll work on.
Oh, sure.
But most of those are on motorcycles or ATVs if it's that kind of a trail. And then they have they call trail cats, but they have small dozers and small backhoes that they'll build trail. And so that's another
What about
crew. And then there's a lot of the Northwest Youth Corps, which arm of them in Idaho is the Idaho Conservation Corps. And there's a Montana Conservation Corps, Utah Conservation Corps, a Student Conservation Association, and over the years, all those folks work out. They basically contract out so many people to work so many days or weeks on a project, and so.
There's some nonprofits too.
And then there's nonprofits like the Idaho Trails Association. They had some projects last year around Idaho. Some are just like a weekend, a one day, or an overnight 2-day thing. Some are week-long trips, like we're doing. Some are, all self-supported backpacks. Some have, have a packer, horse-supported. Some are like jet boat supported on the river. And then there's Sawtooth Society has a small crew that work on trails on the Sawtooth National Recreation Area. The Wood River area, there's a Wood River Trails Coalition, and they do a lot of, mostly on the Wood River Ketchum-Haley area, mostly, that they organize volunteer crews, and they have paid employees, and this year they're actually paying for, they have 4 employees that are working with the Ketchum District Trail crew. And then there's Idaho Backcountry Horsemen. There's different chapters around the state, and there used to be a real active Sawtooth chapter out of the Haley Ketchum area. I don't know if they're doing much of anything now. They kind of aged out, but there are other groups around the state. Different ones have helped us, with trail projects a lot, and there's some of them that'll pack in other kinds of volunteer crews, and that have the pack support or pack in, and they'll do stuff like they've built metal horse corrals. Some of our made horse trailheads and stuff. They've come up with the funding to buy the materials and brought in the welders and all their different members and built the corrals in the weekend. And then there's the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation. And that's another trails organization that mostly works in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness and the Frank Church Wilderness. And they think maybe they have a few employees, but mostly they lead volunteer trips.
And most of these most of these groups do volunteer stuff.
Yeah, volunteer stuff.
But anybody listening and wants to participate doing
yeah,
trail stuff,
yeah.
they could probably reach out to these organizations
Yeah,
and go
yeah.
out in one of these.
And one national organization we worked with for a long time was American Hiking Society. They were based out of Washington, D.C., and they sponsored trips all over the country. And so I'd usually put in for a trip or two for a few folks to help us with projects. And then, of finally they got a new wimp in the office and said our projects were too strenuous. How do you build trail without being strenuous?
Yeah.
But the folks that came out were really, we had a few folks that weren't so good, but most of them were really good. People that would spend their hard-earned 2 weeks of vacation to fly or drive out to Idaho from somewhere and go out and build trail or work on trail.
And get bit by mosquitoes. And
Bit by mosquitoes, and they were good people, and had multiple people that came back multiple years in a row, and they really enjoyed it. We had some really good folks, but anyway, had those crews for about 10 years, and then there was a group, National Smoke Jumper Association. It's kind of centered out of Montana, out of Missoula, but they were folks that have been smoke jumpers sometime in their career. Some have been career smoke jumpers, and a lot of them, jumped for a few years and then went on to be engineers or foresters or whatever else they did. And they had have a volunteer organization, and they came for 20-some years. They had a crew that came, and some of the core of the crew were the same people that came all those years.
Are they still around?
They were around, but they would, I'd pack them in, or somebody would, for, 10 days working on trails. And then a lot of that group got a little older, so they did more of like building fences and corrals and information signs at the trailheads and helping paint some of the buildings and those kind of things. And then a lot of the folks that were coming here finally kind of aged out and died, whatever. And I think they're still doing projects somewhere, but they haven't came here for a while. A lot of those groups, they do really good work, but then hard to recruit younger folks back in to take in the crews. And then, let's see, there's others.
What about Pug?
Yeah, and then this group, the Pulaski Users Group, we work on mostly trails on the Sawtooth National Recreation Area and the south end of the Frank Church. What's it called? Frank Church. Should know the name of that. The official name. Frank Church River Northern Return Wilderness. And the Sawtooth Wilderness. And,
You said you retired in 21?
in the end of 2018.
2018, good.
And then I did a few day trips early in the year on some of the bike trails.
They can't keep you away.
And I did
What are you still
4
doing out
weeks, 4 days of removing fence on the obsolete fence on a ranch the forest had purchased for wildlife, so they could get through. I think we took down 2 1/3 miles of trail,
Wow.
fence, and removed, what do you figure, like 3.5 tons of wire and steel post.
Oh, wow. And you
Like
packed that
pronghorns
out?
and deer and stuff in the free range instead of having to climb through the wires.
How'd you get it out? Or, how did you haul it out?
They came in with some big trailers and just had to hand load onto
Oh,
trailers.
yeah.
And then several years I've been helping Caitlin, the person that has my position now, design some trail reroutes and some relocations. It's always fun. The fun part of the job is I've been more experienced in designing, the trail locations, figuring out what to do with a problem piece of trail, how to fix it or how to move it.
Yeah, those kind of problems are fun. What keeps you coming back?
I don't know any better. I just like working in the woods, yeah. And then it's really good to see, younger generations carrying on, trying to keep their skills built up so they can do the work safe and keep taking care of the place. That's a big thing.
Do you have a message for future trail builders?
Just, try to learn all you can from the experienced folks, and then try to mentor newer folks, keep them going on, and take care of the place, keep it going. And, I
Take care of it.
this is a new area for me, other than the last few years volunteering here, but a lot of the trails in the Sawtooth and White Clouds, I put in decades working on them, and then as budgets and stuff with the forest got tighter, and we had a lot of fires and a lot of bug kill, and, people just haven't been able to keep up with it, so it's good to get crews back and trying to resurrect some of these places. Literally put years and years of sweat and blood into. Lots of sweat. Try not to leave much blood and hide. A little bit of that. Kind of wishing I'd saved all the boots I'd worn out over the years out here. I'd probably have a truckload.
Instead of throwing them on power lines?
Yeah, well, no, I didn't do that. I used to go in and stick some worn out boots on the desk every day. When do we get a boot allowance? Then eventually the Forest Service doing that. Been having some challenging situations in their life and got away from their kind of the old bad environment and working on the trails all summer and stopped back by a couple years later. It kind of turned their life around and going in a more positive direction. Only had to bail one crewman out of jail. Past caught up with him. Laid on child support payments or something. He showed me a driver's license, but a judge somewhere had said that wasn't valid anymore. Got stopped on the road. Go down to Challis to get him out of jail. But stopped by a couple years later and was on some kind of a geology field trip in college. And a lot better. Remember that fellow was always talking, and so we had another fellow on the crew that was deaf or wore hearing aids. I remember one night around camp, and he looked at me. He's gone. He turned his hearing aid on. When Jim came to camp, he turned it off. Had one fellow that was red-green colorblind. And, we used to use campfires a lot, and see us pulling pull off the red dead branches to start the fire. Well, he couldn't tell the difference. He's trying to light them with a green fire. And then a couple of us thought wandered around the meadow, and wild strawberries were ripe. And so we were crawling around on our hands and knees eating the wild strawberries, and he couldn't see them. And, what are you doing? Oh, we're eating bugs.
Great to hear all the stories, but I gotta hit the...
Yeah, it's getting dark.
Yeah, I think I'm ready. Brush my teeth and crawl in the tent.
Thank you for sharing. That's awesome.
Hope you guys have a good night.
You too.
See you in the morning.
And thus concludes Jay's delightful backcountry storytelling. Jay Dorr is a national treasure. What a privilege it was to spend time on the trail with him. Hiking trails don't build or maintain themselves. Unfortunately, trail systems on federally managed public lands across the country are falling ever further into a state of disuse. A growing portion of critical trail work and maintenance is being performed by nonprofit and volunteer organizations, stepping in where legacy agencies no longer have the capacity to handle the responsibility. Such organizations, found in all shapes and sizes around our country, are reliant on individuals like you to take part in the taking care of our public lands and the trails that access them. How, then, may one participate in the stewardship of our public lands? I suggest reaching out to one of the organizations mentioned by Jay in the conversation. They'll be happy to hear from you. I'll leave links to such organizations in the show notes. Should Central Idaho be too far a detour, then perhaps a well-crafted internet search may bring you closer. Please reach out if you need further assistance making the connection. Finally, I send my thanks and gratitude to everyone out there dedicated to the stewardship of our public lands and resources. Keep it up. And if you're still listening, I thank you for being such a wonderful, captive audience. You're awesome. Stay kind to yourself and others. Farewell.